The usage of the word "the trouble interval of time" was first coined by Martin Behan in 1820 in his work An Impartial History of the Irish Rebellion. In the year 1798, Volume 1, this saying eventually evolved into the term we all know today as the Troubled Year, itself used by many local and national historians to refer to the year of 1798, the year of the United Irishmen. The early yearnings of the Revolution began after a long incumbency owing to the cruel and drawn-out leanings of the penal laws. Many believe that these and the growing upsurge in revolution and war overseas encouraged the beginnings of the United Irish Society. Maghera is a small town in the north of Ireland, approximately 122 miles from Dublin and about 40 miles from Belfast, although these distances are not necessarily the same as they would have been in 1798. Its main economic trade was the linen business, which also had a small brewery which distilled malt, whisky, and port. Many great men hailed from the small town and the surrounding area during the 1788 period, such as Walter Graham and the Rev.John Glendy and their commander, William McIver. Although at its conception the rebellion was mainly a Presbyterian affair, Irish Catholics did eventually join them in a small number in this endeavour. What is not commonly known is that McIver himself was a member of the Catholic faith. This is one of the only times that all members of different faiths alike bonded together against the English, and it was probably owing to this that the state's retaliatory response was so brutal. Right, I will start off by reciting the United Irish Oath, whose author was said to be the Rev.John Glendy. In the awful presence of God, I do voluntarily declare that I will preserve in endeavouring a form of brotherhood of affection amongst Irishmen of every religious persuasion, and that I will also persevere in my endeavours to obtain an equal, full, and adequate representation of all the people of Ireland. I do furthermore declare that neither hopes, fears, rewards, or punishment of any kind shall induce me to inform, give evidence against any member of this society, similar societies, or any Irishman or woman of any religion who has proclaimed for the freedom of Ireland. As a Protestant, I extend my hand of sincerity to my Catholic brother, and as a Catholic, I extend my hand of sincerity to my Protestant brother, in the common cause of all that is dear to our native land, so help me God. Previous to 1798, the last 83 years since the introduction of the penal laws in 1715 had been troubled for Maghera and its outlying areas. Catholic priests conducted secret masses at what now known as Mass Rocks, ingeniously hidden places of worship that were designed to make it hard or near impossible for the redcoat patrols trying to seek them out. The Maghera area has many of these Mass Rocks. The most commonly known would be Kearney's Glen. The others are scattered throughout Granaghan and Glen Shane, and many, many more throughout the Sperrins itself. The Presbyterians did not fare much better under these rules, and was probably one of the catalysts that incited support amongst their ranks, though it was not this topic that started the organisation of the home militias. The Maghera volunteers, as they were called, had the Rev. John Glendy as their chaplain and captain, and the colonel was Alexander Clark, who lived in Maghera House, now known as Victoria House. At that time, the fear of the French invasion in the late 1780s was a real threat. As the movement grew in strength and speed, the populace were running out of patience with the state and its hope of reforms and its outdated penal laws, and the long-awaited Emancipation Act. Walter Graham was a frequent visitor to the Presbyterian Synod in Dublin, where his revolutionary spirit grew. Being well educated and an elder in the local church in Maghera, he was well suited to the task and was picked to represent his district. This in turn would have brought him into contact with many other members of the leadership of the United Irishmen, such as Henry Joy McCracken and William Orr. In 1792, after the United Irishmen's Review in Belfast, volunteer corps rose up all over the counties of Ulster. In Maghera, the National Guards were formed, whose uniform was a green tunic faced with yellow and black, with silver buttons bearing the harp and shamrock in a spray. At one time it is said that the ranks of the United Irishmen in Maghera had 5,000, but accounts are varied and not reliable. At the time of the Austrian and Prussian expulsion from France, the United men used the event for their own cause, as the next few local stanzas will demonstrate. Before the glance of newborn freedom, Irishmen did first behold, we lay blind, like captives bleeding. Fly to arms, you heroes bold. Viva la, ye northern heroes, may the north and south agree. Dread nor fear shall never scare us, viva la, we will be free. The Rev.John Glendy famously erected the sign Vive la Republique, honouring the revolutionaries in France, that had an echo effect around the world. The creation of the United States some time before had led the way, and the world was watching. The Reverend Glendy was born in County Derry on the 24th of June 1755. His father was Samuel Glendy and mother Mary. At an early age, Glendy felt the unmistakable pull towards the ministry, and was thus sent to a Latin school until the age of 14. After doing so, he travelled to university at Glasgow, where he passed the rigorous curriculum and theology exams, and was eventually licensed to preach as a Presbyterian minister. The Reverend Glendy arrived in Maghera in the year 1777 as a successor to the Reverend David Smiley. A year later, he was ordained on the 16th of December 1778 as the new minister of Maghera. There are many different stories connected to John Glendy and the rising. As aforementioned, his name is recorded in the original muster rolls of the Maghera Volunteers, who were established on November the 12th, 1780, a time when the threat of French invasion was a very real prospect, as they had for some years now had been the allies of the United States, who the French had helped gain their independence. He was their captain and chaplain. The commanding officer, as before mentioned, was Alexander Clark. Now at this time, as the time passed away, the enthusiasm of the volunteers died down, and the National Guards were created. The name itself had a thinly veiled reference to the French Revolution. For a few years the daily routine passed as normal, but simmering underneath was a desire for this newborn idea of freedom. And one of his speeches reflected this mannerism. We have a reaction from one of his sermons, recorded by James Spotwood of the Salters Company, denouncing him vehemently in a letter to the authorities on the 13th of July 1794. Glendy of Maghera is tainted with the blackest principles of revolution to King George III and all his royal subjects in this kingdom. His many sermons are but political discourses containing treason. We know that he and the so-called members of his meeting attend at mass in full regimentals of a rebel army out of the king's peace. We have seen him on divers occasions with the parish priest of Magherafelt, in that union of the Roman Church with whom he doth conspire against the realm. In the delivery of a discourse in the meeting house, papists are present, and on the pulpit were printed in black letters, Vive la Republique, out of honour to the bloody revolutionaries in France. On June the 1st, 1798, 4 delegates from the neighbourhood of Ranelstown met via arrangement at Castle Dawson. 6 delegates from Crewe, Garva and Maghera. We know that Walter Graham and William McIver were 2 of the delegates from Maghera. The strategy was that the risings would take place simultaneously, thus confusing and distracting the attention of the army. Their other orders were to disarm the local yeomanry and Orangemen of the respective districts, and if necessary form a junction with the patriots of Antrim, with whom daily contact would be kept. On the 7th of June, uniforms were issued, weapons retrieved, and orders given. The small force that were based in Maghera were easily overpowered, and the town was taken. The United Irish, under the leadership of McIver, now held Maghera. The first order of the day was to dispatch 2 riders to Antrim to see if their forces were needed there. On arrival, they were told to hasten with all speed. On their way back, while heading to Maghera via Tuam, word reached them of the defeat of the United Irishmen at Antrim, and efforts were made to take down the bridge at Tuam, thus giving the forces at Maghera more time. and also to slow down the approach of the advancing army under General Knox and Colonel Leith. The dismantling of the bridge at Tuam commenced at 6 in the evening, and owing to the nature of the well-placed masonry, was difficult to dismantle. A total of 14 hours of hard labour were required to destroy it. At 8 o'clock the next day, the main arch of the bridge collapsed into the river. But even as the messengers rode towards Maghera, word spread of the approach of the Beauvais Yeomanry Cavalry, under the command of Captain Langford Hayland, could be seen in the distance. His job was to cut off the retreat of the United Irish Army and then link up with Colonel Leith. It has been said that 1/10 of the men at Maghera were armed with firearms. The rest were armed with either turf spades or pikes, the most of which came from the old forges at Castle Dawson, Maghera, Swatter and Forgetown. The pike was an effective weapon at close range, and what perhaps maybe a few of you will know is that it was primarily used to forcibly dismount cavalry. How that was achieved was the main pike itself had a blade which was offset to it, thus being able to cut the bridle or pull the rider himself off the horse. It was also used as an infantry weapon or in a defensive capacity. The pike was an ideal weapon of choice for the movement, inexpensive to produce. Some even say they could have been made from horses' shoes. The pike was first used as a medieval weapon, though they had, having been designed on the phalanx spear, called the sarissa, first used by Alexander the Great. Other weapons were swords and pistols if the person could afford them. The United Armies had cannon, but they were poorly supplied and trained. No cannon were at Maghera during 1798, except for a British military unit placed on a hill overlooking Maghera, ordered there by Colonel Leith. As a result, the blacksmith Devlin, who made them, was half hanged between the shafts of his own cart, out at the Forgetown Bridge, which is not that far from the 5 Mile Street. Out of interest, the old gates that used to hang on the front of Glen Chapel were also made by the same Devlin family. There are many conflicting accounts of what happened. Some say that the assembled men fled, fearing the wrath of the oncoming redcoats. In other accounts, the leaders fled the field, and in another version, the leaders pleaded with the assembled mass to march off the field, fearing it would turn into a bloodbath. The weapons between them were no match for a fully equipped redcoat army in the field. In any case, reports were often reported that they fled the field without putting up a fight. In my research on this topic, I have come across accounts in parish and local and even international history that certain elements stood and fought their ground, not as one thinks, as in a classical battle where two armies are lined up in ranks and fire into each other until one or the other capitulates, but in small skirmish points around the town's borders. Another tradition has it that Father Matthew McCusker, known as Dean McCusker, who was the parish priest in Maghera during 1798, anointed a dying man in the front of the cornerstone at Walsh's Hotel, then at Maghera, indeed adding more certainty to the prospect that some stood and fought their ground for as long as they could. Another skirmish happened at Glendy Fort, the United Irishmen being repulsed by the Beauvais Yeomanry Cavalry. Could it be possible that this man fought in one of the skirmishes that Father McCusker anointed and gave comfort to? After the field uprising, the Redcoat Army under Colonel Leith marched into Maghera and secured the town. Initial suggestions tell us for the town's involvement in 1788 rising, they were prepared to blow the town to pieces with a detachment of cannon which had been placed on the top of the hill overlooking the town on the road to Glen Chapel. In Lewis Joseph Walsh's My Own Wee Town, 1938, he spoke of an old woman who as a child was once set on top of these cannon in order that she could for one last time cast her eyes upon Maghera before it was blown to pieces for its complicit rebelliousness in the United Irish movement. But the military authorities in Maghera were persuaded to spare the town this terrible fate. Again, I myself agree that only in the most dire circumstances would this have happened, and gives one the idea that Maghera must have been a strong base for the United Irishmen, noting the fact that the military were prepared to take such steps to destroy the town. The Ayrshires took the town. Commanding them at that time was a one Lieutenant Colonel James Leith. His second in command was Captain Francis Lamont. After a short period, he was informed by General Knox that he would be in command of all forces in Maghera. Once he established his headquarters in the old church of St. Luric, with of course the permission of the local rector, a man by the name of Clotchworthy Sodden, an ardent loyalist in the cause of the state. He was also by chance a clerical magistrate. In all of my research, friend and foe alike, no one seemed to like nor trust this man, and he was apparently kept at arm's length by the populace of Maghera. Once headquarters had been established, Colonel Leith and a small detachment went out on patrol first, coming to the Reverend Glendy's house and manse at Vesper Hill. At first he billeted soldiers there, then after a while he ordered his troops to burn Glendy's house. Unbeknown to Leith, John Glendy had fled to a place called the Grove with a man named Wilson, where he stayed for a period of 2 weeks before being helped by a woman who gave him woman's clothing so that he could make his way to Moneynina. The clothes included a petticoat, a cloak, a bonnet, and stockings, and they were all supplied by a woman called Sarah McQuirkin, who would have been a relative of the Clark family. His well-made escape was almost foiled when two men were walking in past him, and all of a sudden one turned round and shouted, "By heaven, it's Glendy!" This man was a ardent royalist and a magistrate, and was about to call out when his companion, a former member of Glendy's congregation, held him and said, "Well, if it is Glendy, you and I will have no part in putting a rope around his neck." The man held him till Glendy had disappeared out of sight, thus undoubtedly saving his life. The second time on the road to Tobermore with a redcoat patrol which passed him and found nothing amiss. He stayed some time at Moneynina, then one day he walked across the mountains to his father's house in Derry. His nephew, James Macartney Smith, tells us that the house had been surrounded by the army, but a sharpness of mind enabled him to baffle them for a while. He threw his clothing, etc., up onto the canopy of the bed and climbed up himself, and was hidden while the troopers entered. They found the bed warm and remarked, "The nest is warm, but the bird has flown." He had smashed the back window of the room, which had deceived them. Glendy eventually waited until the periods in martial law had eased a little. After a certain period of time, he eventually handed himself in. Glendy was sent to a prison ship called the Postlewith in Belfast that was moored in Belfast Lock. And there he spent time with the famous United Irishman, the Thomas Leslie Birch. He was then, they were both then banished to America and given only a few days to sort out their affairs. The second house to be burned in the district was Watty Graham. The redcoats, on not finding him, exercised great brutality and even killed the pigs in the sty, as the old saying from the period goes. Even the pigs did not escape the yeomanry's vengeance. A reward of £500 was offered for the capture of Watty Graham. Taking leave of his family, he set off for Magilligan, intending to cross to Moville, where a passage had been arranged to him to America. On his way, he stopped at the house of people named Kenna, where he was given food. Hot on his trail, the soldiers called there, not being satisfied with the explanation given, they burned the house, which was the birthplace of Father John McKenna, who later erected Glen Chapel. And if you go inside, you'll see a beautiful marble plaque to his memory, which is up the right-hand side, up the top of the chapel. This, out of coincidence, was the third house in the district to be burned. Watty Graham stopped at the rectory of Tamlock in Magilligan with the intention of collecting part of a debt of £400 owed to him by its occupant, a Mr. Church, possibly the same Mr. Church referred to in a letter from Bob Lowry. This man, seeing in Graham's difficulties a means of ridding himself of his liability and at the same time earning the reward, made the excuse to his creditor of having to go to a friend in Maghera for the money. In reality, he turned informer. A servant girl in his employment overheard remarks made to him by his wife and suspected treachery, but before he left, Church swore her to secrecy. The next day or so during dinner, which consisted of potatoes, herring, and sweet milk, the maid endeavoured to warn Graham. When leaving a fish on the table, she remarked, "A herring was never caught for its belly." Putting down the jug of milk and tumbler, she said, "A herring was never taken on bait." Watty appeared to miss the first hint, but he replied to the second. "Girl, do you mean something by that?" In distress, the girl ran to the window, looked out, and shouted, "Colonel, the soldiers are coming." They could be seen approaching through the wood at the rear of the rectory. In a field at the front of the house, some workmen had just started to dig potatoes. Graham ran over, shouting to them, "Men, I am betrayed." He called a slip of a lad, says, "Young fellow," says he, says, "give me the shovel and then run." The youth, before doing so, put on Watty's coat and ran. Church and the commanding officer and the soldiers followed him. The rector quickly observed that one of the men wore a linen shirt while the others had calico. He recognized Graham and told the soldiers, "Take the man with the linen shirt." Less than a year after this betrayal, Mr. Church got a message to attend a lady parishioner on her deathbed. He saddled his horse and set off. Within a few minutes his riderless horse came galloping home. The rector had been bludgeoned to death at the entrance of his own avenue. Then I took my journey where I was not known, and quickly departed into Inishmen. But I was soon apprehended for being a strange man, and taken I was on Magilligan strand. Taken I was and brought into Coleraine, and there in cold irons for to remain, till a party of soldiers came from Maghera. They told Watty Graham he's to die by the law. The traditional belief is that Watty Graham was hanged on a big beech tree which stood in the corner of the rectory grounds next Church Street, until it was blown down in a storm on the 21st of September 1946. I have also been told that the place of execution was the entry between what was then the market house and the house below it on Main Street. It is said that a chair swung on chains between the buildings sat a linen tester who passed or rejected webs of linen, handed up to him from a weaver's carts beneath him. It is thought that Graham may have been hanged from this contraption, and the bleeding head was then put on a spike and given to a man called Charles Cassidy to carry through the streets and to proclaim to the people, "Behold the head of the traitor." But the poor man stammered his lines and instead said, "Behold the head of the crater." The bleeding head was afterwards spiked on the church tower for a week and then placed in the market house on the orders of Colonel Leith. His relations hold the traditional belief that on the night of the execution his body was taken either by arrangement or by force from a single soldier who guarded it and buried near Glendy. When times became more tranquil, it was exhumed and stealthily reinterred in the old churchyard. Fear of discovery prevented the erection of a headstone over the grave, which is said to be marked by an uninscribed slab. Arthur Kingsley Porter, late of Harvard University, says the most developed representation of the crucifixion I know in Ireland is on the portal of the church at Maghera. How fitting that it is that the mortal remains of our patriot should lie in the shadow of this sacred scene, awaiting the resurrection call of him who himself was betrayed. Another fact that his wife and 2 daughters were forced by the redcoats to watch this terrible act of wanton barbarity. Afterwards they moved to the New World and tried to put distance between their griefs. Watty's mother and father survived their son, as this old ballad of the period tells. Farewell, wife and children, I bid you adieu, likewise my old parents who dwell by the Crewe. Another United Irishman who played the ultimate sacrifice was Thomas Clark. Thomas Clark was born at Swatra in the year 1773. The house that he lived in afterwards occupied by one Thomas Hamilton. His mother owned the property on which it was built, a corn mill, a kiln, and a small brewery. After the abortive rising, Thomas Clark was caught at the long gap at Gurlachie River, which divides Swatra from Ringsend. He was given away by his little dog, which followed him everywhere. Tradition has it that a government agent reported to the authorities that Thomas Clark, instead of making barrels for his brewery, he was using it to make pikes for the United Irishmen in the district. He was arrested on a written statement of an agent, even though it could not be proved, but Clark was still not released. However, they offered him his freedom, if he would supply the names of his brave associates, which he refused. He was thus removed to Derry Jail. While in Derry Jail, Clark was taken out into the prison yard for 10 successive days, and was stripped and flogged even until the most hardened yeoman refused to continue this dreadful work. Eventually a professional torturer was brought in to complete the work started by the yeomanry, but for all the torture he stayed true to his principles. Now there are many different accounts of how Thomas Clark met his end. One is that he was court-martialed, sentenced to death, then hung, drawn and quartered. It's told that his head was placed on the wall of Derry Jail for all to see. Underneath this gruesome spectacle was written on a sign, a warning to all traitors. The second story tells that he committed suicide by drinking arsenic in his cell, rather than take any more torture. This account was always thought not to be reliable. While on the subject of blacksmiths, a United Irishman called Jack O'Kane was arrested along with another blacksmith from Crewe, both suspected of using their forges to produce pikes for the rebellion. O'Kane was almost flogged to death in Swatra. He owned lands close to where the Church of Ireland in the parish of Killelea now stands. Another farrier called George Workman of Carhill, roughly about a mile on the Swatra side of Garva Road, was also closely watched on the strength of information received. The soldiers swooped on his house where he and his mother lived. The cunning old lady was doting in her old age, but was able nonetheless to stop the betrayal of her son. So frustrated were the yeomen that they set the house alight. The officer in command was about to throw her into the fire when she remarked to him in a typical Scottish accent. He abandoned his plan of action, touched with pity. "Such bonny buttons on your claes, son." About 2 weeks after the arrival of Scottish troops, a detachment of Tipperary militia and Derry militia came to Maghera to reinforce the troops already stationed there. It was at this time that the Tipperary militia became involved in riots between themselves and the populace of the town. The church that they had been stationed had formerly been that of the Rev.John Glendy's. The United Irishmen. During their incumbency at this building, they smashed the pews and interior for firewood. The congregation saw this as an act of desecration. Rather than stand the insult, they fired the building and it burned to the ground, along with the church registers, muster rolls of the National Guards. And now we come to Billy Cuddy. One of the most popular feints or folklore that has passed into our subconscious is the predicament of a man called William Cuddy. Local tradition suggests that Billy Cuddy, another rebel, managed to cheat the gallows, a friendly soldier having cut him down when half hanged. To deceive the authorities, a mock funeral was staged in the old graveyard of St. Lurik's for all to see as the weather-beaten stone with its strange inscription, "The burial place of William Cuddy," spelt with one D. I am, however, personally inclined to place more faith in the Reverend Professor Walthrow's version of the story given in his Cook Centenary Commemorative Address, page 2, in which he says, "Another case excited much commiseration at the time, because according to local tradition, the victim was quite innocent of any complicity in the movement. He was a man of humble rank by religious profession, a Camerolian, roughly what is now a Covenanter, who followed the somewhat incongruous trade of a wheelwright and a bluedyer. His name was William Cuddy. An unseasonable jest cost him his life. He had been employed by someone to insert a pane of glass in a leaden window frame, and while doing so remarked jolly that it would not be difficult to turn the lead into bullets. The remark was reported, and at a crucial time more importance was attached to it than was deserved. He was forthwith tried by court-martial and condemned to die. From the guardhouse, which was the Porter Lodge at the head of the avenue leading to the rectory, the condemned man, dressed in his grave clothes, marched up the street to the place of execution. As he passed along, he sang the portion of the 57th Psalm at the top of his voice. Rightly or wrongly, the unfortunate man blamed the rector for being the cause of his death, and those who listened to the weird music of his dying words were not slow to make application to the verse. "Why dost thou boast, O mighty man, of mischief and of ill? The goodness of Almighty God endureth ever still. thy tongue mischievous comblities, decisive subtlety, like a razor sharp to cut, working deceitfully. I more than good and more than truth, thou lovest to speak wrong, for thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue. So God shall thee destroy for aye, remove thee, pluck thee out, quite thee from thy house, out of the land of life thy shall thee root. The righteous shall it see and fear, and laugh at him they shall. Lo, this is the man that did not make God his strength at all. As he stood at the place of execution, the poor fellow once more declared his innocence, a fact that the whole neighbourhood believed. Colonel Leith, the officer in command, touched by his pity, asked him whether he should leave the case in his hands, which all around regarded as an offer of mercy. But the condemned, either in the excitement of the moment or perhaps misunderstanding the words, replied that he would leave it to a higher power. The officer understood this to be a rejection of his offer, and he was forthwith hanged, but no further indignity was inflicted upon his body. Another interesting story relates to a young man who sailed to France in 1798 to attend the Irish College in Paris. Thomas McKenna, who was from the Maghera area, said he was from the Glen and was aboard with General Hoche in Bantry Bay with the first ill-fated French expedition, and also spent time with Napper Tandy, that great gentleman of renown, who once Napoleon considered so important he included him in one of the major treaties of Naples. The Tips, as they were locally known, had arrived in Derry City in 1796 to reinforce the city's defensive militia. During 1798, most of the Tipperary militia were Catholic and had English gentry officers, and had the reputation of being mistrusted by their superiors. A contingent were dispatched to Maghera about 2 weeks after the failed uprising to reinforce Colonel Leith's Ayrshire yeomanry. After that time, riots tore through the town of Maghera for a few months until everything settled down. The Tips and the Yos were the shortened word that the population used to describe the redcoats in town. Interestingly enough, they were also part of the force which swept the Limavady to Dungiven areas for weapons in 1786, recovering 95 muskets, 7 bayonets, and a few pistols in preparation for the advent of a French invasion. They were also dispatched to Moneymore and Marafelt. The Reverend Father Matthew McCusker was one of the last parish priests of the penal times educated and trained in France, leaving behind a brilliant scholastic career to follow his heart in his native Ireland and County Derry. The aforementioned priest is the same person who anointed a dying man in the cornerstone at Walsh's Hotel in the year 1798. Father McCusker had a friendly relationship with Captain Lamont, who was second in command, and also from Omagh. Colonel Leith was the overall commanding officer in Maghera. One morning, while riding past Walsh's Hotel with Colonel Leith at his side, he eyed a fair young maiden tidying the rooms in the hotel. His glance was rewarded with a smile. This encouraged the young captain to remark to his commanding officer, "Sir, if that young lady is not already married, she will be my wife." And true to his remarks, the Monsignor married them on the 23rd of May, 1798, writing in the parish records of the Church of Ireland, Captain Francis Lamont of the Aberdeenshire Invincibles to Miss Anne O'Neill of Maghera. They were both laid to rest in Glen Graveyard, and out of interest, Captain Lamont is on the list of persons who donated money to the building of Glen Chapel. This date also tells us that the troops were in Maghera before the rising, so all the operations would have been carried out around them. Just to add a note of interest, Alexander Falls was given permission to carry 1 musket, 2 pistols, and a sword, a difficult concession to gain in those days, by Colonel Leith. Out of interest, Alexander's brother Thomas Falls was accused of consorting with an assisting United Irishman. The same Shane McKenna was blamed of harbouring Falls and would give nothing away to his interrogators, after which he was arrested and escorted back to Maghera, but subsequently escaped close to the old Flax Dam in the townland of Carramina. No order was given for pursuit, and he escaped. I have always thought it must be quite odd to be pursued by your niece's husband. Another point of interest is the black stone mounting block in the corner of the hotel. It is a landmark and still has its census mark if you look at it carefully. The cornerstone, as it is locally known, was used for a means to mount your horse and would have come in handy to the wives who rode pillion on the back of the horse with their husbands. Back to the subject of Father Dean McCusker. He was in good terms with Captain Lamont. Between them they came up with a plan for the local inhabitants to disarm and leave their arms at a house out at Glen. So great was the appeal that the weapons and gunpowder had to be stored in the dry arch of Galwally Bridge, or Mackay's Bridge as it is known now. This marked the end of the troubled year for the town of Maghera, which culminated in the burning of 5 houses in the district and the execution and banishment, as well as forced exile for many a Maghera man. As this poem of the period proves in Owen Walsh's famous Maghera Men, our town is true and our martyrs too, and high in the scroll of fame we inscribe with pride the men who died, McKeever, Clark and Graham. For the north began and the north held on from Toom to the hills of Down, and the foremost man in a Corley's van was the man from our wee town. Colonel James Leith. In 1794 he was commissioned as a colonel to raise the Aberdeenshire Fencibles. He commanded the regiment in Ireland until it was disbanded there in 1803. In 1804 he was given commands in Europe and distinguished himself in the Peninsular War. In 1813 he became Lieutenant General, and in 1814 he was made Commander of the forces in the West Indies and Governor of the Leeward Islands. He implemented the restoration of the French West Indian Islands to the Bourbons, but when Bonaparte returned from Elba, most rehoisted the tricolour, so he reconquered them for King Louis of France. In August 1815, after sharp fighting in Guadeloupe, he died of yellow fever in Barbados and is buried in Westminster Abbey. In an odd twist of fate, Colonel Leith's own uncle Andrew Hay was hunted for being a Jacobite commander who fought in the army of Bonnie Prince Charlie and hid in Leith Hall for 2 weeks until passage to France was arranged for him. He spent out the rest of his life there in exile. He is, historically enough, the only Jacobite that was ever given clemency for his role in that battle. The Graham family, after being forced to watch her husband's horrific execution, his wife and daughters eventually emigrated to the United States of America, and was it any wonder to see if a new life would lift the burden of watching what they had seen? Nothing more is known about the Graham family, not even their names. I have heard it said once that one of his daughters returned in later life, but nothing more is known about her existence. William McKeever, although referred to on occasions as McIver, escaped the Redcoat patrols and made his way to Resharkin, a United heartland at that stage, from where he made his way to other United men at Ballycastle, where he hoped to keep up the fight, but to no avail. He finally got passage to America, where he lived out his life. His son, a colonel in the Union Army during the American Civil War, would often speak of his father's daring exploits and the fate of his comrades during '98. The Reverend Glendy arrived in America in the year 1799, where he was joined by his wife and children, where they made their home in Norfolk in Virginia. The climate proved unfavourable to Mrs. Glendy's health, and they were compelled to seek a different location at Staunton in Virginia. The Reverend Glendy excelled in the new United States, becoming chaplain to the House of Representatives in 1806 and to the Senate in 1815 to 1816. Out of interest, Glendy gave an oration on the memorial occasion of General Washington, which was delivered in 1800 and later published in 1835. The Rev.John Glendy died at Philadelphia on the 4th of October 1832 and was buried in Baltimore. Clothworthy Sodden was the rector of Maghera from 1785 till 1817 and was buried in Kilcronahan Old Churchyard. The Earl of Bishop once said about him, "Good man, Sodden. One may trust Sodden with anything but one's purse and one's bottle." The aspects of 1798 in the town of Maghera is much the same as the country all over at that time. It is, in many ways, respectfully drew out lines in the sand which have unfortunately had a galvanizing effect on both sides of the community, which have carried through to the 20th century. Maghera now has greatly changed since then. What, I wonder, would the men of '98 say about our town now?